part. People can join as we go. So welcome everyone. Just to begin with, I want to share some housekeeping rules with you. Please make sure that your name is clearly entered and keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question, and you can also just use the chat if you're uncomfortable or in a location where you can't unmute yourself. And then keep in mind to always use respectful and appropriate language if you ask any questions. A few words about the network, the ECOP network of the European Marine Board. We're a network for early career professionals at EMB member organizations that was established by the EMB Young Ambassadors and the Secretariat. And we want to give ECOPs the opportunity to network and meet peers across Europe, and also to gain a voice at the European Marine Board level. And one of the things that we do is host these seminar series, these ECOP Wednesdays, every first Wednesday of the month. And today, I'm very happy to welcome Sašo. He did his PhD in European policies and is now working as an environmental consultant. So I think he has some very interesting insights for us. And I'm very happy to have him here today and talk about marine environmental policies, how they get implemented and how to engage. And with that, I want to give the word over to Sašo. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thanks so much for having me. Okay, let me see if I can share my screen again. Does this work? Great.
Yes.
So, hello everyone. I'm Sašo. I'm here to talk about marine environmental policies and how they get implemented. And how to engage. Thanks a lot for the invitation, and thanks for Alexandra for all of her patience, because I was constantly late in organizing this. So just, oops, quickly about me. So I've relatively recently finished my PhD. So I've defended in November last year, graduated this June. And as you can see, my kind of progression through tertiary education was going from natural sciences more and more towards social sciences, to the point where I now consider myself a social scientist, but I understand enough about natural sciences that I can kind of engage with natural scientists as well. I'm currently working at Active Environment, so it's a French consultancy company. I work on a number of European projects on implementation of EU marine environmental policies, but I also worked in between my master's and my PhD, mainly from Slovenia, from public institutions and from NGOs, on a bunch of different, mainly projects, but also some support on EU marine policies at a national level. So today I'll talk about some of my experiences in implementation of policies directly, some results from my PhD, and then also leaving plenty of time for discussion after. So I'll start with linear science policy interface, just because this is still the most predominant preconception of how science and policy interact, even though it has been heavily criticized in social sciences for decades now. But given it is still kind of what most people would understand, I'll start here and then we'll go further. So within this kind of idea of the science policy interface, the idea is that science or research produces knowledge, which is supposed to be relatively objective, removed from outside influences, and then this knowledge is then passed on to the policy institutions, to the governments, ministries, commissioners, etc., who then implement it into policies or use it to implement existing policies, to formulate new policies, and so on. So within this conception, it's most of the work of researchers as such is to communicate their knowledge to the policymakers. And there is this expectation both on the research side that we produce knowledge and we just communicate it and that will lead to impact. And on the policy side, it's often also, I mean, there is this need to have evidence to support policies and their implementation, and that the knowledge that they receive should be this objective knowledge produced without outside influences and so on. So that's how most of the interactions or formal interactions between science and policy usually work. So you will often get people producing papers and then sharing papers widely in the hope that they will be read and taken on board and influence some policy decisions or implementation patterns. Often now you will also see the need to produce policy briefs or kind of shortened summaries that can be ingested more easily by policymakers. And there's also a number of technical working groups established in which researchers can directly engage with policymakers and support specific processes. So if you look at how this then works at the EU level, we on one hand can claim that we have arguably some of the best marine environmental data on the planet, especially compared to the other parts of the world. And also the European marine environmental frameworks are known as being some of the most wide-encompassing, stringent, and ambitious. But the situation in the UCs is that the UCs remain some of the most anthropogenically pressured in the world, and we have quite a wide array of official reports kind of assessing the implementation of EU policies, and the assessments are generally pointing towards the EU policies being incoherently implemented, not fully coordinated, and ultimately not fully effective. And these reports come from the, for example, European Commission or the European institutions themselves, or also from the NGO sector, which then begs the question where we're going from, given that we have most of the or the best possible data that we could have compared to the rest of the world. Obviously, there are still gaps, and some of the best policy frameworks. And on the research side, it's often research general public side, it's often the blame is put on the policy side. So these policy makers, policy actors are bureaucrats that do not listen to science, they do not listen to facts, they have their own agendas, the political influence is strong. There's also ideas that policy actors or civil servants are kind of ineffective in their comfortable public permanent positions, impossible to get rid of, and therefore kind of a drain on public resources. I'm not saying that I agree with any of these characterizations, it's just that I've heard them myself, and I still hear them from my parents, for example, when I used to work in the public sector. It was a very common thing that how they conceived my job. But what is the reality? And I'm sure that there is other views or other experiences, but this is based on my experiences in the public sector, is that the policy actors are generally highly educated. So the university degrees are the absolute basis, and a lot of them will have PhDs in particular topics. Therefore, a lot of the policy actors implementing policies will be really bright. They will have their own ideas. They will have their own technical background on which they draw on when they work on the policies. And they therefore cannot be thought of like tabula rasa, where we just provide them with new information, that new information will influence what they do. They already have knowledge on which they base their decisions. And that any new knowledge will, in the best case, be combined with their existing knowledge. They're often also very driven, at least when they join the public institutions. With the more time they spend there, they sometimes lose some of this or become more jaded by the system within which they have to work. But they're generally not people who just stand around and wait for the next thing to come. However, they tend to be part of large, very bureaucratic and hierarchical organizations, which does limit the speed and what they can do on an individual level. So in most public institutions, depending on the size of the country or the state or whatever, each institution will have from several hundreds to thousands of people employed, and there are then procedures in place to ensure that whatever is done is fair, it's transparent, there's anti-corruption procedures and so on. But that can often devolve into really, really bureaucratic procedures for decision making. So I'll give you a very banal example, but one that actually happened to me. Is I worked on a European project as a project manager. We wanted to organize a workshop for which we had the funds, and it was described in the project itself. And I needed to buy some facilitation materials. So Post-its, markers, posters. The the full value of it being 20 euros or thereabouts. For that, I needed to get 3 offers, official offers from 3 different providers. Those offers, then I had to choose the cheapest one, and then still need to get 7 signatures from people above me to allow me to spend 20 euros. And the whole process in this particular case was extremely smooth, and it took a day. So you can imagine that when it comes to spending actual money or making more important decisions, that the whole process becomes a lot more convoluted, and there's a lot of things that need to be taken into account, which limit the decision-making power of most individuals and the speed with which they can respond. The other thing is then that if you look at actual marine environmental policy frameworks in Europe, they're extremely convoluted and complex. So some papers, in this case, Boris and Elliott for 2014, have studied more than 200 policy pieces, all linked to marine environmental problems in the EU alone. Some others have, looking at the level of regulations, have counted more than 12,000. So you can imagine that implementing such a vast policy framework with overlaps with objectives that are not fully aligned, with a lot of these policies being sectoral and not integrated, other policies being holistic but needing to integrate other sectoral policies, is extremely complex, and nobody has a clear overview of all of it. So what then happens often, especially for example, in smaller countries or in smaller public institutions, is that one person or a couple of people will have responsibility for implementing 2 to 3 European directives, for example, each of them coming with their own set of processes and procedures that need to be followed, their own sets of engagements of different institutions, and it's a lot of work, which basically means that a lot of policy actors, especially the ones implementing policies, tend to keep juggling a number of different things at the same time and trying to just keep the most important fires under control that they have. It's very, well, in my experience, it's quite rare to put any fire completely out. So they're generally very busy and often overwhelmed. And even when it seems like they're not doing much, or the results that are produced in the end are less ambitious or less, less great than what we expected, it is often because there's been so much other stuff going on. And this also comes into play when we come to the fact that how to engage with the policymakers, because it has to be kept in mind that at any given time, they will have a number of different things that they're working on, and us engaging with them or specific researcher engaging with them about their work might be very low on their priority list. So that was my own experience, but as part of my PhD, I also talked to a number of policy actors from the national level to the regional sea convention level to the EU level. And these are some of the quotes of what they said when describing the way that they engage with science. So the names are all pseudonymized, but at least there is an indication of at which level the quotes are coming from. So Naomi worked for an EU institution and said that science has to be filtered to get to us. She mainly uses national reporting and agency reports, such as the European Maritime Safety Agency, the European Environment Agency. I do not look at individual scientific papers. Naomi then also emphasized the importance of timing, which is crucial, the urgency of things, and of course of formats. So the policy implementers need the precise information at the very moment. If you don't have that, then the policies are done anyway. You cannot stop the train has gone. And if the policy evidence is not clear and ready, if it's ambiguous, if it's not there, then yes, it is not taken into account. Brina worked for a regional sea convention and says that they work so much on their own assessment that they produce at the regional sea level that it's where she internalizes most of the information from. So again, not directly from scientific outputs or from research papers, but from integrating the knowledge that comes from national reporting, from the stuff that their working groups have produced and have been integrated into the assessment. Carrie, another person from an EU level, says underpinning of decisions with hard data is of course important, but sometimes scientists cannot deliver that because science is not always so accurate. It's not easy to find one person or organization that can deliver what we want. What we're trying to do is an expert proposal for policy. We are the administrators, but we often come from technical backgrounds. So especially at the EU level, you will find that often the policy officers are people who have worked in research before joining the EU institutions. So they are experts in the fields in which they work on. And then when they do produce policies or strategies, documents, etc., they look for data, but they often look for very specific data to support what they're planning to do already. So it's not like us or like what we are taught of when we're doing PhDs or when we are within the university systems, when we have to do literature reviews, we have time to look at a very broad array of literature and then base our action on that. It's more kind of time pressured and targeted in the policy world. Ladon, also the EU level, says that he gets most of his information from his networks, again, not looking at the reports or scientific papers mainly. And then from the national level, Luke, for example, said that they hire really pay universities and marine institutes about time to think about the questions that we ask of them. So again, in terms, if you look back to this linear science policy interface idea, it's not research producing knowledge on their own. It is they're producing stuff that they've been asked to produce and paid for. So this is then not the case of what I'm going to say now, of what Luke has been telling me, but I've seen cases where an institute has been hired or paid to produce certain expert bases, and then the competent authority in question did not like what was produced and refused to pay the institute for their work until the results were changed to be more appropriate for the competent authority. It might not happen often, but it does happen. And then Charles, also from a national level, emphasized the importance of state assessment. So that refers to national monitoring programs, which are in place and are running constantly, but they're not pure science as such. They exist outside of that, and they mainly just produce those reports, analyze the data that comes from national monitoring programs, and use that in their decision making. Again, not looking that much outside into what has been produced in science as such. But then this is also before we then go into the social psychological backgrounds of decision making. This is part of the work that I've done in my PhD. I will not go into methodological details now, but I'm happy to talk about it later if needed. But basically, part of my PhD looked into how key policy actors across the EU, so again from national level, so the EU level, how they see the marine environmental crisis, particularly in relation to marine nature, and how to use the existing European policy framework to address it. And what we found is that there was at least 5 different ways of how the issues are framed and which policies are then prioritized. I'll just quickly go through them to illustrate. So we had a very strong framing. So people in this framing, so key actors, people in general, would consider that the marine environmental crisis is catastrophically dire, and the only way that we can possibly act or revert the trends currently is to do everything that we possibly can. So that they would argue for the most strict possible implementation of EU policies, basing that on a lot of literature or data that's out there. So basically, they would claim that we have the goals of 30% protection of marine environments and 10% strict protection. In their view, the 30% of the EU seas should be no-take areas, because claiming that there has been research showing that multiple-use protected areas are barely better than the non-protected areas, and then 10% of EU seas should be no-go areas. They claim that active restoration has not been very effective or it's very expensive, so it's better to just completely exclude people from certain areas and allow passive restoration of nature to go its way. They would also take the data from the fisheries management and claim that fisheries, despite having common fisheries policies in Europe, the fisheries in a lot of the European regional seas are still unsustainable. Therefore, common fisheries policies has failed in their view. And therefore, we should be a lot more draconian with what we impose. So they would, for example, support a complete ban of bottom trawling fisheries in all of the European seas. Then if you move to the strict framing, they would agree that the environmental crisis is dire, but they would claim that being exclusive, that excluding people from the environment is not the way to go, and that the state of degradation in which we are is due to human actions, therefore we have moral responsibility to act. So in their view, they would still want to have 30% of European seas protected, but in multiple use protected areas. 10% would then become no-take zones. All of the rest should be managed sustainably through maritime spatial planning or through common fisheries policies. They would oppose spot trawling bans and would be very, very supportive of active restoration efforts, claiming that since we've degraded the environment to this level, it is our job to now kind of move this back actively. Within the regional framing are people who would say that the EU policy framework is useful, but it is too strict, too rigid, and not adaptable enough. Therefore, it would be better to focus on the regional sea conventions and their kind of softer, more cooperation-based approaches. And they would then also support more kind of functional conservation approaches. So combining climate modeling with biodiversity models, with moving MPAs and so on, which is currently does not exist within the EU policy framework, which is way more kind of specified in terms of species habitats that need to be protected. The pragmatic framing as the next is the most optimistic. So they would basically claim that we have everything that we can possibly need, both in terms of policies, of tools, we just need to implement. And they see the possibility of doing that properly in this decade. But in their view, the implementation of European policies should be flexible and pragmatic. So if we do not get 30% or to 10% strict protection, that's fine as long as we improve. And also they would, rather than on kind of conservation policies or spatial protection, they would prefer to focus on policies managing diffuse pollution sources. So for example, we need to lower the pressures in general, not only focusing on protected areas. And then we have the sustainable use framing, which acknowledges that environmental crisis is definitely happening and we need to move towards more sustainable ways of using the seas, but would either claim that it's that kind of fulfilling the needs of people, the livelihoods, is the most important priority. So that is why they would focus on policies such as maritime spatial planning, common fisheries policy, blue growth, but making sure that those activities are sustainable. Or there's people in this framing who would claim that these policies or the policy objectives of doubling the blue economy or etc. are not the best, but they would claim that unless we engage the main actors that put pressures on the seas, so economic extractive sectors, we will not achieve much. Therefore, we need to work through policies that directly engage them and bring them on board, which is the same set of policies that maritime spatial planning, common fisheries policies, rather than the strict environmental policies. And what happens is then often that people within these different framings, even though they clearly prioritize different policies, often use the same data sets to support different policy outcomes, so different prioritization of policies. So as I mentioned, a very strong framing, they would use the data on the overexploitation of fishing stocks in EU seas to claim that common fisheries policy is not working. But the sustainable use framing would use the same data set, just claiming that in the Atlantic it works. In the Atlantic, we have seen that certain fish stocks are recovering currently under the same policy, therefore the policy works. And it's the same data set supporting the two different, very different sets of policy priorities. Then additional part of the work has been in bringing these people together into workshops. So I've done 3 workshops. Only one of them is presented on the screen to be clearer. But basically what we did was we brought policy actors, again, experts, scientists that work on policies together. They were given 5 statements linked to the previous framings. They first ranked them in terms of how much they agree or disagree with them on their own. Then they discussed it together, and then they were allowed to change their ranking if they changed their views. And keeping in mind that a lot of these people have worked together for decades before, they know each other, they trust each other. And what we found is that very few people change their opinion after provision of more information or arguments. So in general, across all 3 workshops, only 15% of participants change their ranking after the discussion. And in most cases, it was because they misunderstood the statement in the beginning. So for example, doing simple mistakes such as mixing strict protection and just normal or marine protected areas, which points to the fact that the provision of just data is not really as influential as we would like it to believe in making sure or in the decisions that are being made. So people would refer back to the existing knowledge they have, to the reports or whatever they've read or participated in, and to their value systems. And it's really, really hard to change that with just provision of new data. Which then leads us to the point of how do we navigate this world, especially as ECOPs, if we want to have policy impact. So my first recommendation would be to just try to directly engage with policy actors. So there are meetings, there are groups into which it is possible to get. It might take a while, but it is possible. Or to interview them, invite them for seminars, try to directly engage with particular policy actors and create your own networks through which you can get information or through which you can influence people. It works way, way better. So for me, if I can share the experience from my previous job, where I worked for a forestry institution on strictly protected beach forests under UNESCO World Heritage designation, in which we had to work with the Ministry of the Environment. And the Ministry of the Environment and the forestry institution for which I worked had a relatively antagonistic relationship at the time. So the cooperation between the 2 institutions was not very smooth. And the only way that I could then work with the key person from the ministry was to spend 4 hours driving to Vienna to a meeting together and being able to get to know each other on a personal level, to the point that she could stress me that I would represent the conservation interests within my institution, my boss in my institution trusting that I will present the forestry ones to the ministry. So the whole relationship worked because of the personal relationship among the key people involved. But that being said, and keeping in mind that the fact that policy actors are often overwhelmed or have a lot of different things, it can take a while to get them to respond or to get them to engage. So often if you're just asking for interviews, my experience has been that it takes up to 5 weeks to get a response and 3 to 4 reminders. That does not mean that people are not willing to engage or that they are ignoring us. It just means that maybe the initial email came at a really busy period and flew under the radar, or they were interested, but other things were more important, so they again forgot to respond. So there's often cases where I would get an email back after the 4th reminder saying, oh, thanks for coming back again. I wanted to respond before, but it just didn't manage. Happy to engage now. If you want to engage with the different events, it often takes months from the point where someone suggests that you can come to an event to the point where you get actual information about how to join, and that the decision can come very last minute. So there needs to be a lot of perseverance and patience. The other thing is, and that is, I think, a mistake that is often made in academia, is that we are counting on academic papers being read in the policy realm. And it's not that nobody reads scientific papers, but that the reading of papers is much more limited among the policy actors. One is we don't have time. Even when certain work is externalized to research institutes or to consultants such as us now, we are not paid enough to spend a considerable amount of time reading broadly about a topic. So it's more often we find papers or literature that support what we need to say, but we do not go much, much broader. Similarly, and as the point I was making earlier, I wouldn't assume that provision of data alone would be enough to make policy actors act or change their opinions. The fact is that we have so much data currently from so many different fields that we can find data to support very different, even antagonistic policy objectives and actions. So simply providing some more data will not really necessarily have the impact that we want to have. And then really, really importantly, is to be aware of the relevant policies and their cycles and processes that are involved in them. So most policies will run through a policy cycle. So the cycle on the slide is a general cycle for creation of policies and their update, but most of them will have a similar cycle built into the implementation. So there will be a part of the policy implementation cycle focused on the assessment of the environment or of the needs or whatever. Another stage on the setting of the policy priorities or targets. Another stage on monitoring of the impact, another stage on the implementation or on the measures, implementation, evaluation of the whole thing, and then it repeats. And these cycles take between 4 and 8 years, which basically means that, for example, if you work on assessing the state of the marine environment or providing new information about what is happening in the seas, and you've missed the window in which the state of the seas has been assessed within the policy cycle, this will not be reopened until the next cycle when this can happen. So if you've been very unfortunate and the report on the state of the seas has just been finished and reported, it might not be reopened for the next 6 years. And the policy actors will move on with the other steps. They will not be able to really dwell on the step that has been finished, even if new stuff has come up, unless this new stuff is really something super acute and important that needs to be managed right now. Otherwise, we'll just move on with what has been established in the preceding step and then building on that. So it is important to know when the cycles are happening, when it is useful to provide information or push for certain implementation, or what has been put into the state assessment so that we can push for certain measures to be taken on board, but we need to be aware of where we are in the cycle. And the same goes also for new policies. It's just that it's slightly trickier because by the time a new policy draft is shared publicly, it has already been going through numerous steps before, and then again we have been changing some, or we want to influence that it has already been kind of set. So in that case, you would need to get information from your policy contacts when they start discussing something new, so so you can engage at the proper stage as well. But I think that is it from my side. I'll be very happy to have a discussion or answer any questions now.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk, for your presentation.